Here we are continuing our discussion of CSS, and the discussion right now is CSS Grid. So, I sent you off to read about grids here, and hopefully you're coming back with lots of great ideas and good information. Let's apply that to CSS Grid now, right? Or the grid property, right? In code, right? So in the past, you may have used a grid with Bootstrap or Material UI or one of the other CSS frameworks. These grids are totally different than the built-in grid. I don't know if these have adopted the new CSS Grid, but these were built before the CSS Grid property was available, right? So they use a totally different system, right? Bootstrap uses some extra row divs, and so it always requires extra markup to get the grid to work. CSS Grid that we're going to do is totally different. Okay, so you can read up on these if you're familiar. You can skip over this, right? You may have a couple questions, so let's answer the questions that I thought of. So question: what does CSS Grid do, right? Well, just like Flexbox, CSS Grid property, display grid is what we're talking about, right? It arranges all of the children in a grid. So where Flexbox, display flex applied to an element, arranges all of that element's child elements in a row or a column, CSS Grid does the same thing. If you apply display grid to an element, all of that element's children are arranged in rows and columns. Okay? How does CSS Grid differ from Flexbox? Well, Flexbox is a one-dimensional layout, okay? So it works in a single dimension or single axis. Flexbox, it can either be on a row or a column. Now, there is a flex wrap property, so you can get kind of a grid effect because things that run off the edge of the, or reach the width of the container can wrap onto the next line with Flexbox. But it's really not like CSS Grid. Like Grid, it kind of can look like you can make a grid with Flexbox, but CSS Grid can arrange things in a more complex way. Okay, so if you're doing a grid, you probably want to use grid over flex. Okay, but if you're just trying to arrange things in a row or a column, then maybe grid is overkill and flex is the best choice. Okay, so flex, one dimension, one axis. Grid is two axis, horizontal and vertical. Okay, so why use CSS Grid over systems like Bootstrap? Well, CSS Grid doesn't require any extra, abstraction. You don't need an extra library. It's built in. You can just use it directly. It's got pretty good support these days. I haven't looked it up. Actually, just for fun, let's check the support. So I'm going to look up, can I use CSS Grid? Right? And let's see. So can I use is a website that shows us, compatibility, like what browsers are compatible with which features, right? I'm gonna go to usage relative. So you can see here, like there's a couple browsers don't support grid yet. Let me see here. Can I use grid layout level 1? I'm not sure if there's a difference between grid level 1 or some other one. Let's look up grid there, right? I guess that's what we get. So if I look at this though, you can see Opera Mini doesn't support it, and Safari Chrome 3.2 doesn't support it. But this usage relative shows us what percentage of browsers that people are actually using today, right? So global, 25% of people are using Chrome 58 to 90, right? And if I go over here to Chrome 90 for Android, it's like 38% of people are using that, right? So, if we look at the usage relative, Grid's got pretty good support, okay? So, yeah, why would we use it over Bootstrap? Well, it's built in, so we don't need an extra library. It works really good. Like it's not complex enough where it needs abstraction or it needs some way to simplify it or methods to make it easier to use or class names or anything. You can just apply Grid directly. I also think it's much more flexible. So especially if you're doing responsive layout, you can change the grid entirely just by changing the CSS properties. This is a lot easier than using Bootstrap, where Bootstrap requires us to put in divs that have a row property on them or a row class, right? So there might be a situation where you want to break a row and that becomes difficult or weird to do. Also, if you're using Bootstrap, you have to add the row div. So that's kind of like adding markup and structure to your HTML document that is really not needed, and really shouldn't be in there, because what you're using it to do should belong to the presentation layer or the presentation part of your code, right? So if we think about separation of concerns, anything that handles the layout should go into our CSS and not be like mixed in or embedded in the structure of the document. Okay. Can you use Flexbox and Grid together? Yes, you can, for sure. You can put a grid inside a flex. You can put a flex inside a grid. You can mix and match them. You can put you can create a grid that has a flex, and then inside that flex you have another grid. You can nest them any number of levels deep. Okay, so they totally work together. Okay, let's talk about using CSS Grid. So when you and first let's get a little vocabulary, right? So columns look like this, right? So here's a column, and the space between the column is called the gutter. So here I have a 6-column arrangement, right? And when we create our grid or define the grid with display grid, we'll also define how many columns we have, right? And we can set the grid gap, which is the space between the columns. In everywhere else they call it the gutter, but in the CSS properties, it's called grid gap for the space here. Okay. Rows look like this, right? So, and there's a gap between rows, so you can set the gap between the columns and rows can be different, or it can be the same. And the height of each row can be flexible, or it can be fixed. If we put it together, we get something like this, right? Okay. And when we define grid areas, right, or grid cells, what we're going to do is we're going to draw a cell that covers a number of columns and rows, and it will never end in the gap. Okay, so this won't end like partially in the gap here. Okay, it'll always leave the gap empty. So when you define the gap, that'll always be a space, and it'll be consistent throughout your page. Okay, so any cell that you create can be any number of columns wide and any number of columns tall. Every cell has to be a rectangle, so you can't make a cell that like turns a corner. Okay, you can make cells that overlap. So I can make a cell that overlapped this one. That's probably not a good idea, but it might be, maybe you want to do that for some situations, but in general, you're going to do a layout like this where the cells don't overlap. Okay. So let's make a simple grid. So for this example, I'm going to just make a new HTML document, and then I'll just write the code myself, and you can build this yourself, right? So I'm going to close this thing up and then open up my notes here. So this is class 5. I put all my class 5 notes in here. So I'm going to open this up, and what I think I'm going to do is make a brand new HTML document. So I'll save this. I'll call it index.html. Okay. And save it into my folder there. And then maybe I'm going to open it in the browser here, so I just have an empty document. Okay. And I'll grab this code right here. You could add the whole HTML, the standard boilerplate for your document, but I think I'm just going to truncate it, shorten it to this for clarity, right? And maybe I'll even forego making a separate style sheet, and I'll just put my styles in the style tag. Okay. So right now I have a container, right? And then I have a set of divs that all have the class name box, and then they all have a class name ABCDEF, right? Or actually, I guess I have ABCD, ABCD, right? So let's do a little work here. So I'm going to say A, you're going to have a background color of, I'll just pick some random colors, maybe aquamarine, right? Let's see here, and let's do color B. You're going to be, what other colors do we have there? bisque. That sounds like a great color, right? And let's do another one here, C. And what other color do we have there? Let's do cadet blue. I don't know, right? I think that sounds okay. And then we'll do class name D, right? And I need another color. So what other colors do we have here? Chocolate, great color, right? Okay. Looks like a milk chocolate. I don't know, right? Actually, it doesn't even look chocolate. It looks a little too orange to me, right? Like chocolate is like down in here, you know. I don't know. I don't know who named these things. Okay, so I'm just gonna leave it like that. Okay, so there we go. So I got 4 of these guys, and then maybe let's give them all, just to make things easy, since they don't have any content. Actually, they do. I guess they do have some content. It just has the word in there. But to give them like a little more space, I'm gonna say all of the boxes here will have some padding. Okay, so I'm gonna give it a padding of 2M. Okay. So, so that'll just give a little space around the text, okay? And if I look at my page here, did I make a mistake there? What am I missing here? Oh, there we go. I just had to refresh. Okay, so so there's my boxes. I guess I have these class names A, B, C, D are repeating there, right? So let's do a grid layout now. So I'm going to leave these styles at the bottom there. We can kind of ignore those. Those are just so we have something to see, right? So the first thing I want to do is I want to identify the parent, and I want to declare it as display grid, and then it will arrange all of its children, okay? So the parent in this case is class container, so let's do class container is display grid. Okay, done. Let's make that a little bigger. Okay, and you know, nothing happens, right? So we can't use the grid until we define the rows and columns. Okay, and really you can get away with not even defining the rows as long as you have the columns defined. Okay, so let's do grid template columns. Okay, so as soon as I set grid template columns, it's going to arrange everybody in columns, but I need to tell it how big each column is. Okay, and you can make the columns each, you know, in pixel units. You know, here's 2 columns that are 100 pixels wide each. Okay, so here column number 1, column number 2. Okay. If I want, one of the columns could be larger. I could make it 300 pixels. Okay, let me do that there, right? And this is 300 columns. This is 200 columns, right? And so what is happening here is the browser is looking at container and saying like, okay, you've defined this container as a grid, and it has 2 columns in it of 100 and 300 pixels. And so I'm going to take all of the children and apply each one to a column. And I'll just do it in the order that they appear in their index. So this goes into the first cell. This one is, you know, placed in the second cell. And then this one is placed in the third cell and the fourth, etc. Okay. So how else can we work with this? Well, you know, there is another unit we can use. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this grid template columns here to 1 FR, 1 FR, and 1 FR. When I do that, what I've done is I've created 3 columns, and each column is a fraction. So FR stands for a fraction. So you can see here now it's filling up the full space, and if I change the size of the page, every one of these is 1/3 of the available space, okay? Because it's 1 fraction. You can do multiple fractions too, so I could say 2 fractions for the middle column, and now this is 1/4, this is 2/4, and this is 1/4. So when I said quarters here, essentially like if we add all these up, I have 4 of these, and then we can imagine that each one was divided by 4, right? So this is 25% of the space, 50% of the space, and 25% of the space, right? And if we're doing a certain number of columns, right? Sometimes it could get tedious because you could do like 12 columns and it would be like 1FR, 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 etc., right? CSS gives us this repeat method. So you can say repeat, and then we can say how many times to repeat. Let's do 6 times. And then we can say what to repeat. So I'm going to do 1FR, okay? And now I have 6 columns that are all in equal size. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, okay? And you can repeat actually anything, right? So I could do one FR column and then a 2FR column and repeat that pattern, So that didn't seem to work. I think I'm allowed to do that though. I don't know. Anyway, maybe I made a mistake there. But this repeat thing is really useful, okay? So maybe I'll do repeat at 6 columns, okay? So that's looking pretty good. Let's do one other thing here. So right now the height of every element is the height of the box, which is the height of the content plus the 2m of padding, right? If you want, you can also set the row height. So I could also add in here grid template rows, and I could determine what each row is. So maybe the first row is 1FR, and then the next row is 2FR, And now here I've got 1 height and then 2 heights, right? Now, generally, and you could add, you could repeat in here, you could do, pixels or any other units, right? Generally, though, you probably don't want to set the row height. Like if I do this and then I have more content than fits in the height that the row was defined as, then it overflows and it doesn't fit inside your cell, right? So generally what we want to do is we want to let the rows kind of figure themselves out, right? So usually we don't want to set the row, okay? So it's safer for us to set just the columns and let the rows figure themselves out, okay? So there's your basic grid usage, okay? So you can try that on the CSS Zen Garden. Maybe I'll stop the video here, and in the next video, I'll do an example where we apply it to the Zen Garden page, right? And then we're gonna dig into this a little bit more. CSS Grid has a lot of properties. So there's a lot of different ways you can set up the grid. So I'm gonna show you this method right here, which is pretty good for, a basic grid. But I'm also going to show another method that lets us customize the grid and make our cells fill in, multiple columns, and we can map, elements on the page to particular cells. And that's like super powerful, okay? So anyway, thanks for watching, and then pick this up in the next video. Give this a try right now. Try and recreate the example here, and then give it a try yourself applying something like this to the CSS Zen Garden page, right? And then come back and we'll do it together, okay? Thanks again.